Some stories are buried on purpose, not lost, not forgotten, deliberately placed underground by the people who lived them, because what they contained was too specific, too personal, and too dangerous to let walk around in the open where anyone could find it and recognize it, and realize that the thing the story described was still happening right now. In the ordinary spaces of the world, we all move through without thinking. The 5 accounts you are about to hear were not shared willingly. They were extracted from government files, from professional records, from the quiet confessions of people who had spent years convincing themselves that silence was the only safe option until someone asked the right question in the right room and the silence cracked. Each of these 5 people is still alive. Each of them agreed to this on one condition, that you would never be able to find them. After tonight, you will understand why they asked for that. Welcome to True Terror Files Official. Before we go into the 5, you need to know who they are, because the horror in these accounts does not come from monsters or demons or any of the comfortable vocabulary we use to keep fear at a distance. It comes from professionals, people with credentials, people whose job descriptions place them in ordinary rooms on ordinary days where something extraordinary revealed itself and refused to leave. Tonight, you will hear from a federal land surveyor working a routine boundary verification in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest, who found a brass bench marked with her own name on it and a date 11 years in the future. A telecommunications engineer who started receiving voicemails from his own phone number in his own voice, describing events in his apartment 90 seconds before they happened. A census field worker who knocked on the door of a condemned building and found a woman who matched a 1940 census record, name, age, apartment number, who said she'd been living there since 1938. A municipal water quality analyst who discovered that a specific residential water supply was changing its chemical composition in response to human observation, as if the water itself was aware it was being tested. And a certified court interpreter who was hired to translate for a defendant speaking an undocumented language, and slowly assorted realized the language didn't exist anywhere on earth, and that the defendant wasn't speaking to the court. He was speaking through her to something else in the room. 5 professionals, 5 ordinary days, 5 fractures in the world that never healed. If you are somewhere alone right now, I need you to understand that you chose the right condition for what comes next. If you're new here, welcome. True Terror Files official posts every single night. Something is always waiting. Tonight, 5 things were buried for a reason. We're about to find out what that reason was. Let's begin. Ren Ito was 36 years old and 8 years into her career as a licensed federal land surveyor with the Bureau of Land Management. When she received the field assignment for the Driscoll Ridge Boundary Verification Project in the Cascade Range of the Pacific Northwest, a routine job, the kind she had performed dozens of times, requiring her to locate and confirm the positions of existing federal survey markers. It's called benchmarks, along a section of mountainous terrain that was being reassessed for a potential land transfer between federal and state authority. Work that involved hiking to documented coordinate positions with a GPS unit and a metal detector. Physically locating each brass marker embedded in rock or concrete, photographing it, verifying its stamped designation against the official survey record, and logging any discrepancies for the Bureau's geospatial database. The Driscoll Ridge section contained 7 documented benchmarks placed between 1952 and 1989. And Wren located the first 6 without incident across 2 days of fieldwork. each marker matching its record exactly the designation code, the year of placement, the agency stamp, all correct and unremarkable. The 7th marker was at the highest elevation of the ridge, a position she reached on the afternoon of the 2nd day after a 90-minute hike through old-growth forest, and she found it quickly. A standard 3.5-inch brass disc set in a granite outcrop at the ridge's apex, partially obscured by lichen but clearly legible. And she knelt beside it with her camera and her record sheet and began the standard verification process, which is when the designations stopped making sense, because stamped into the brass in the standard agency font was a name. Her name ran Ito, followed by a date, October 19th, 2037, which was 11 years in the future, and the standard agency designation code for the Pacific Northwest District and the Bureau seal, all of which she photographed 3 times from 3 angles. Because her training required her to document before interpreting, and because she did not yet trust her own reading of what the metal in front of her was saying, she checked the survey record on her tablet. The 7th benchmark on Driscoll Ridge was documented as placed in 1989 with a standard numerical designation. No personal name, no future date, no reference to a surveyor who was 25 years old and in middle school at the time of its supposed placement. She ran the GPS coordinates. The marker was at the exact documented position for the 7th benchmark, within 2 meters of the recorded position, which was well within tolerance for a 1989 placement. She called the Bureau's geospatial office from the ridge and described the discrepancy, and the coordinator on the other end of the line asked her to read the designation again, which she did, and then there was a silence that lasted approximately 8 seconds. Which Wren noted specifically because silences of that duration in professional radio communication are unusual and meaningful. And the coordinator said they would escalate the finding and asked her to complete the photographic documentation and return to the field office. She did. The photographs were entered into the Bureau's evidence review system the following morning. For 3 weeks, Wren heard nothing, which was not itself unusual. The Bureau processed thousands of discrepancy reports, and most resolved quietly through catalog correction, but the silence on this one felt different to her in a way she could not fully articulate. A difference confirmed when the geospatial office finally responded not with a correction but with a request for her to come to the district headquarters in Portland for an in-person review, which had never happened to her before. At the review, 2 Bureau officials and 1 person she did not recognize, introduced only as a consultant, showed her the photographs, alongside a physical comparison marker from the Bureau's reference collection and the brass alloy, the stamping method, the seal design, and the patina aging were all consistent with a marker placed in the late 1980s. Meaning the physical evidence suggested the benchmark with her name and a future date had been manufactured and placed at least 27 years ago, when she was 9 years old and living in a different state and had never heard of the Bureau of Land Management or the Cascade Range or Driscoll Ridge. And there was no bureaucratic pathway through which her name could have been assigned to a federal survey marker in 1989 by anyone, because she had not yet entered the profession, had not yet graduated from the program that would qualify her for it, and had not yet been born the name Ren Ito into any federal employment record. The consultant asked her if she had ever been to Driscoll Ridge before. She said no. The consultant asked her if she had any family history in the Pacific Northwest. She said no. The consultant asked her if the date October 19th, 2037 meant anything to her. She said no. And then, in the specific way that a person's mind sometimes moves faster than their conscious permission, she realized that October 19th, 2037 was a Monday, and that the Bureau's field assignment schedule for the 2037 fiscal year had not yet been drafted, and that there was no mechanism by which a date that far in the future could have appeared on a brass marker placed decades ago, unless someone had placed it there with knowledge that did not exist yet. And the consultant watched her face while she processed this, and said nothing. And the meeting ended with the Bureau classifying the marker as a confirmed anomaly and restricting the Driscoll Ridge site from future field. Assignments pending a review that Wren was told would be completed internally and that she was asked not to discuss. And she agreed because there was nothing to discuss that would make sense to anyone who hadn't knelt on that ridge and seen their own names stamped into brass by an agency that hadn't yet had any reason to know they existed. She has not been back to Driscoll Ridge. She does not know what will happen on October 19th, 2037. And she keeps the photographs on a drive she does not cloud sync. And on the nights when she cannot sleep, she lies in the dark and thinks about the specific weight of a brass marker that has been waiting on a mountain for her to arrive since she was 9 years old. And thinks about what it means that something in 1989 already knew the name she would carry, and the work she would do, and the ridge she would climb, and the day she would need to find it. And she has decided that whatever is waiting in that future date was not placed there to warn her, because warnings are directional and a benchmark is not directional. A benchmark is a fixed point. Declaration that something is known and stable and permanent, which means the marker on Driscoll Ridge is not a warning. It is a record of a future that has already been written, and her name is in it. Declan Marsh was 31 years old and worked as a senior network reliability engineer for a mid-sized regional telecommunications provider, a position that required both the technical knowledge to diagnose complex infrastructure failures and the specific temperament to do so at 3 a.m. when the alert system woke him and the clock was running on a service restoration deadline. A temperament he possessed in abundance, because Declan was by both professional necessity and personal constitution. A person who responded to anomalies with methodical investigation rather than alarm, which is the frame of mind you need to understand he was in when he checked his phone on a Thursday evening in June and found a voicemail from his own number, his personal mobile number, the one assigned to the device in his hand at a timestamp of 7:14 p.m., which was the current time minus approximately 90 seconds, meaning the voicemail had arrived 90 seconds ago from a number that was the number of the phone receiving it. And he had not called himself, and no one else had access to his phone. And he was sitting alone in his apartment, and the voicemail was 12 seconds long, and he played it, and the voice was his own voice, his own cadence, his own specific way of dropping the ends of sentences, and it said, "You're going to get up from the couch in about 80 seconds and walk to the kitchen and open the refrigerator and stand there for 10 seconds and then close it and go to the bathroom and turn on the faucet and look in the mirror." And then the recording ended, and Declan sat on the couch with the phone in his hand and did not move, because the voicemail had just described a sequence of actions he had not yet taken and had no prior intention of taking. And the specific detail of it, the refrigerator, the 10 seconds, the faucet, the mirror, was too precise and too arbitrary to be a coincidence. And he stared at the phone and at the wall opposite the couch and at the kitchen doorway visible from where he sat. Then, because he was an engineer, and because the alternative was to sit in the paralysis of not knowing, he got up from the couch and walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator and stood there and counted, and at exactly 9 seconds, the overhead kitchen light flickered once, a brief stutter of darkness that he had never seen before in the 2 years he had lived in the apartment. And he closed the refrigerator and walked to the bathroom and turned on the faucet and looked in the mirror. And behind his own reflected face, in the reflection of the bathroom doorway, there was nothing, no figure, no shape, no presence, just the empty hallway he had walked through 30 seconds earlier, and he stood there with the water running. And looked at that empty reflected doorway and felt something he could not name. Not fear exactly, but the specific disorientation of a person who has just watched the boundary between prediction and experience dissolve. Because the voicemail had not guessed it had stated in his voice what he was about to do 90 seconds before he did it. And the light flicker at 9 seconds was not something he could have planned or predicted or self-fulfilled, because he had not. He known it was going to happen, which meant the voicemail contained information about the future state of his apartment that he did not possess at the time it was recorded. And he went back to the couch and checked the call log, and there was no outgoing call from his number at 7:14. Just the incoming voicemail notification with no associated call record. As if the message had been deposited directly into his carrier's voicemail system, without passing through the calling infrastructure he spent his career maintaining. He told no one that night. He told no one the following day. He told no one when it happened again. 4 days later, a second voicemail from his own number. His own voice, describing his actions 90 seconds forward with the same precision, including a detail he could not have anticipated. The neighbor's dog barking at a specific moment, which it did, which it had never done before at that hour, and the voicemail had mentioned it by name. Over the following 6 weeks, Declan received 11 voicemails, each following the same pattern, his number. His voice, 90-second lead time, details he could not have known, and he documented every one, transcribing the predictions and writing down what happened with timestamps, building an evidence file that no telecommunications framework could explain, because voicemail does not arrive without a call path and a call path leaves. Infrastructure traces, and these messages had no call path, no originating switch, no routing record. Nothing except the audio file, materializing in his inbox, like a message that had bypassed the entire network and arrived from somewhere the network did not map. He finally told one person, his colleague Marcus, another engineer, and Marcus asked the question that changed the shape of the experience. Do the messages ever describe anything happening in the room that you aren't doing? Anything you can see that isn't you? And Declan went back through his 11 transcripts and found, in voicemail number 7, a single sentence that didn't describe his actions, the bathroom door is going to close on its own. He had not noticed it at the time. He had been too focused on what he was doing. But the transcript recorded it, and he remembered the door closing and assuming he hadn't latched it properly. And the voicemail had stated it would happen 90 seconds before it did. And the door had no draft behind it, and no broken hinge, and no mechanical reason to close. And he sat with that sentence for a long time, because the voicemails were not predictions of his behavior. They were descriptions of what was about to happen in his apartment, including things that had nothing to do with him, which meant something in that apartment was generating accurate 90-second forecasts of events in the space, and was using his voice to deliver them, and had been doing it for 6 weeks. And he had been so focused on verifying the predictions that he had not yet asked the question that the 7th voicemail had already answered. There was something else in the apartment that the messages were tracking, something that moved doors and flickered lights and made dogs bark at nothing. And the voicemails were not a warning to Declan about his own future. They were a surveillance feed of something else's future, delivered in his voice to his phone 90 seconds before it happened, as though whatever was in the apartment wanted him to know it was there, and wanted him to know that it knew exactly what it was about to do. Gloria Fenn was 52 years old and had worked as a field representative for the United States Census Bureau for 19 years, which is the kind of government service career that sounds unremarkable from the outside, but requires a specific and underappreciated combination of stamina, interpersonal skill, and tolerance for the strange. Because census field work means walking into every type of American housing stock in every type of American community, and knocking on doors that do not want to be knocked on. And Gloria had knocked on thousands of them across 4 decennial cycles and dozens of smaller survey campaigns. And she had developed the calm professional presence of someone who had seen the full range of human domestic situations, and had learned not to register surprise at any of them, which was the disposition she carried with her on a Wednesday morning in April. When she approached the Harmon Street address in a declining industrial neighborhood of a small Midwestern city, a 3-story brick apartment building documented in the Bureau's address canvassing database as having 12 units, 6 of which were listed as occupied according to the most recent administrative records, and the other 6 listed as vacant or condemned. The specific unit she was assigned, Unit for C, appearing in the condemned category, should have meant a vacancy confirmation rather than an occupant interview. But the address canvassing update from the prior month had flagged Unit 4C with an anomaly notation, resident reported present, no corresponding utility account, which was unusual enough to trigger a field visit rather than a mail survey, and Gloria walked up the stairwell to the 3rd floor, noting the progressive deterioration of the building's common areas, water-stained walls, missing ceiling tiles, the smell of old moisture, and the particular stillness of a building that has been empty long enough for its sounds to stop. And she reached Unit 4C and knocked, and the door opened, and standing in the doorway was a woman who appeared to be in her late 60s or early 70s, small and thin, with white hair and the specific posture of someone who has lived alone for a long time and has organized her body around the dimensions of a space she does not share. And Gloria introduced herself and explained the purpose of the survey, and the woman listened politely and invited her in. And the apartment was clean and modestly furnished in a style that Gloria registered as consistent, with an earlier decade a rotary telephone on a side table, a fabric-upholstered sofa with wooden armrests, a small kitchen with appliances that looked original to the building's construction in the late 1930s, no television, no computer, nothing electronic or digital, the apartment of someone who had not participated in the technological shifts of the last 40 years. And Gloria conducted the interview, according to the standard instrument, collecting demographic information. The woman answered every question clearly and cooperatively, and when Gloria entered the data into her tablet and cross-referenced the name against the Bureau's historical records for quality control, she found a match, the same name, the same date of birth, the same apartment number and building address in the 1940 census, which was the earliest digitized record the Bureau maintained. And the woman's age in 1940 was listed as 31, which would make her 117 years old now, but she was not. She looked, at most, early 70s, and Gloria, with the practiced neutrality of 19 years of field work, asked the woman how long she had lived in the building, and the woman said, since 1938. And Gloria asked if she had any family in the area, and the woman said no. Gloria asked if she had a current photo identification she could verify for the record, and the woman said she didn't believe in photographs. Gloria completed the interview and left the building and sat in her car for 15 minutes, processing the specific quality of what had just happened which was not that she had met a woman who didn't age. That was the dramatic interpretation. And she was not a dramatic person, but that she had entered a condemned apartment in a condemned building with no active utility accounts and found a furnished, functioning living space occupied by a person whose identity matched a federal record from 84 years prior with the same name and apartment number and no explanation for the discrepancy. And when she reported the visit to her field supervisor and the supervisor cross-referenced the building's status with the city code's office, the confirmation came back that the building had been condemned in 2009, all utilities disconnected, all residents relocated, no authorized occupancy since, and the field supervisor asked Gloria to return to the building the following day to verify the unit's status with a codes officer. And Gloria returned, and Unit 4C was empty, not furnished and occupied, but genuinely, structurally empty, with the same water damage and ceiling collapse. And bare concrete floor as the other condemned units on the floor. No furniture, no telephone, no woman, nothing except a faint smell that Gloria could not identify and could not forget. A smell like the air in a room where someone has been living for a very long time. And she has never been able to reconcile the two versions of the apartment she experienced 18 hours apart. And the Bureau closed the case as a canvassing error, and Gloria accepted that classification in her paperwork and not anywhere else. Because she knows what she saw and who she spoke to, and the specific way the woman answered the question about how long she'd lived there, not with confusion, not with the disorientation of someone who has lost track of time, but with the calm precision of someone who knows exactly how long they've been waiting and has not yet decided to stop. Sam. Okafor was 28 years old and 3 years into his position as a water quality analyst for a municipal utility department in a mid-sized city in the southeast, which was a job that combined the routine precision of laboratory chemistry with the occasional field work. Necessity of collecting samples directly from residential taps when the automated monitoring system flagged a reading that the lab couldn't reproduce from the distribution point. A process that was ordinarily unremarkable. You drove to the address, collected samples from the tap into sterile containers, logged the time and temperature and residual chlorine, and drove back to the lab with the address on Pimento. Drive flagged on a Tuesday in July with a reading that made no chemical sense. A pH profile that fluctuated within the same 60-second sampling window, cycling between 6.8 and 8.4 in a pattern that no natural water system produces. And the automated system logged 3 discrete fluctuation cycles before the alarm triggered, which meant the water was doing something at that address that it was not doing at any other point in the distribution network. And Sam drove to the house, which was a modest one-story ranch occupied by a single elderly tenant who had not reported any water quality complaints. And he collected his samples from the kitchen tap following standard protocol first draw, after a 2-minute flush and a second draw, and sealed the containers and logged the data and drove back to the lab. And when he ran the samples, the pH was stable at 7.1, perfectly normal. No fluctuation, no anomaly, and he rechecked the automated system logs and confirmed the alarm had been genuine. The readings had been logged, the fluctuation pattern was in the record, and his lab results said the water was fine, which meant either the automated system had malfunctioned or the water had changed between the time it was monitored and the time it was sampled. And Sam was an empiricist and did not prefer either explanation, so he did what a good analyst does. He went back to the house the next day and collected samples again. But this time he brought a portable pH meter and tested the water at the tap in real time. The meter read 7.1 stable, normal. And then he set the meter down on the counter to label a sample container. And while his attention was on the container and not the meter, the reading jumped to 8.4, and he looked at the meter, and it read 7.1 again, as though it had never moved, and he thought he had misread it, and he continued collecting. And he set the meter down again to write on a label, and this time he positioned his phone to record the meter's display without looking at it directly. And when he reviewed the recording later, the meter's display cycled through the same fluctuation pattern the automated system had logged: 6.8, 7.1, 7.9, 8.4, in the exact intervals between the moments when he was looking at it and the moments when he was not. And the pattern stopped every time his eyes returned to the display, resumed every time his attention shifted away. And Sam sat in the lab with that recording playing on his phone and felt the specific cold recognition that arrives when data tells you something your framework cannot accommodate. Because water does not behave differently under observation. Water is not a quantum particle. It does not collapse a waveform when measured. It is a chemical substance governed by equilibrium. In thermodynamics, and it does not know you are looking at it, except that the water at Pimento Drive was doing exactly that, changing its composition when observed and reverting when unobserved, as though it possessed a state it wanted to display and a state it wanted to hide. And the distinction between those two states mapped precisely to the presence or absence of a human attention directed at it, which is a property that water does not have and cannot have under any known physical model. And yet the recording was on his phone, and the data was in the system, and the pH readings were real and repeatable and conditional. On whether or not someone was watching, and Sam went back for more times over the following 3 weeks, and each visit produced the same result: stable readings under direct observation, fluctuation patterns on the recording made during inattentive periods. And on the 4th visit, he ran a full chemical panel on samples collected during observed and unobserved states. And the unobserved samples contained trace compounds that were not present in any other water source in the municipal system. Not contaminants, not industrial runoff, not any substance the lab's reference library could identify. And when he tried to analyze those compounds under direct, microscopic examination, they were gone. The samples reverted to standard composition. And the compounds existed only in the water that was not being looked at. And Sam reported the findings to his department supervisor with the recording and the lab data and the full documentation. And the supervisor told him the automated systems. Sensor at that node was scheduled for replacement, and the readings were almost certainly an instrument error. And Sam said nothing about his portable meter recording or his lab panels because he understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has just watched the boundary between the known and the unknown dissolve in a kitchen tap, that no institutional response to this data would be adequate, because the data described a phenomenon that institutions are not built to process. And he has not been back to Pimento Drive, and he does not know what lives in the water at that address when no one is watching. And he has started looking at his own tap at home a little differently, the moments between when he turns it on and when he looks at what comes out. Ines Delgado was 9 years old and had worked as a federally certified court interpreter for 14 years, holding certifications in Spanish, Portuguese, and Haitian Creole, with working proficiency in 3 additional languages: which made her one of the most qualified interpreters in her region's judicial circuit, and the person courts called when the language in question fell outside the standard certification registry, the less common tongues. The regional dialects, the cases where the court needed someone who could determine whether a language was even a language at all, which is how she found herself assigned to a case in a federal district court in September of that year. Criminal proceeding in which the defendant, a man named Felix Amaro, 57, charged with trespassing on restricted federal property, had declined all offered interpreters and spoken only in a language no detention officer, immigration official, or intelligence liaison could identify. And the court had exhausted its standard interpreter pool and requested Inez specifically because of her reputation for linguistic pattern recognition, which is the ability to hear the architecture of a language before understanding its vocabulary, to identify its grammar and phonology and structural logic, even when the words are unknown. A skill that is part training and part instinct, and that Inez possessed in a degree that her colleagues described carefully as uncanny. She sat in the interview room with Felix Amaro on a Tuesday morning and listened to him speak for approximately 12 minutes. And during those 12 minutes, she performed the standard analytical protocol. She recorded the phoneme inventory, mapped the syllable structure, identified the morphological patterns, noted the prosodic features, and began constructing a working grammar. And by the end of the 12 minutes, she had reached a conclusion that she did not say aloud, because she needed to verify it privately, and because the conclusion was, in the literal sense of the word, impossible, which was that the language Felix Amaro was speaking had no cognate in any language family on Earth, no structural overlap with any known or reconstructed tongue, no shared root or grammatical ancestor with any of the roughly 7,000 languages currently documented by linguistic science, that it was not a Creole or a Pidgin or a constructed language or a code. It was a fully formed, grammatically complete natural language that had evolved somewhere among some population of speakers at some point in history. That somewhere was not here, and those speakers were not human.
No.
Because the phoneme inventory included sounds that human vocal anatomy cannot produce. Lateral clicks combined with simultaneous harmonic overtones, sustained egressive airflow through positions of the tongue and palate that do not correspond to any known articulatory configuration, and Felix Amaro was producing them fluently. Without strain, without mechanical assistance, the relaxed precision of a native speaker, which meant either that Felix Amaro's vocal anatomy was not standard, or that the language had been designed for a different kind of mouth. And Inez sat with that conclusion, and then did something that she later recognized as the moment the situation changed. She began to speak the language back to him, constructing responses from the grammar she had just extracted, using her own phoneme inventory to approximate his sounds. And Felix Amaro stopped speaking and looked at her, not with the recognition of someone who has found a conversation partner, but with the specific vertical attention of someone who has just heard a door open that was supposed to be locked. And he said something in the language that she could not translate because she had vocabulary for almost nothing yet. It's just grammar, just architecture, just the shape of the house without the furniture. And she said back what she thought was a question about his origin. And Felix Amaro smiled in a way that she has described since as the most disturbing thing she has ever seen on a human face. Not because it was malicious, but because it was relieved. The relief of someone who has been waiting a very long time for someone to answer, and finally someone has. And then he spoke again, slowly, And this time Ines heard something in the grammar that she had missed before. The language was not being spoken to her. It was being spoken through her. Because the grammatical structure she had extracted was not a system for communication between two people. It was a system for addressing something that was not in the room with the speaker, something that existed on the other end of the linguistic channel, something that the language had been built to reach. And when Ines began speaking it back, she had not been talking to Felix Amaro. She had been opening the same channel from her side. And whatever was at the other end had heard her. And Felix Amaro's smile was the smile of a man who had just watched someone else dial the number he had been calling for years, as the connection was finally going through. And Ines stopped speaking immediately and left the room and told the court she could not interpret the language because it was not a language she could identify, which was technically true and practically a lie, because she had identified it. She just could not say what it was. Because the closest description she has is that it was a phone line to somewhere that was not in the building and not on the planet and not in any coordinate system she possessed the vocabulary to name. And the court reassigned the case, and Felix Amaro eventually accepted a public defender and a plea and a sentence. And Ines has not been called to interpret that language again, but she has been called to 3 other cases in the 14 months since, where the defendant spoke a language no one could identify. And each time she has refused, and each time she has sat in her office afterward, the same thought running through her mind, like water through a crack in a foundation. The language was complete, which means someone speaks it natively, which means there's a population that speaks it, which means there's a place where it is the common tongue of everyday life. And the grammar she extracted in 12 minutes contains specific structural features for describing dimensions of space that human languages do not distinguish, because they are not dimensions we navigate, and she knows with the specific, granular certainty of someone who has held the architecture of a foreign world in her mouth and felt its shapes press against her teeth that the language is real. It is spoken somewhere. It is being learned by other interpreters who will be less careful than she was. And one day someone is going to finish the translation and say the right sentence in the right room, and whatever is on the other end of that channel is going to answer back, and the line is going to be open. And the conversation is going to begin, and it is not going to be a conversation that anyone on this side of the channel is prepared to have. 5 stories. 5 professionals who went to work on a day that looked like every other day before it, and came home carrying something that no degree or training or credential had prepared them to hold. Not because what they encountered was violent or loud or cinematic, but because it was patient and precise, it had been there before they arrived, and it was still there after they left. The benchmark on the mountain that already knew her name. The voicemail that arrived 90 seconds before the future it described. The woman in the condemned apartment who had been waiting since 1938. The water that changed when you watched it. The language that was never meant for human mouths. These were buried for a reason, not to protect you from them, but to protect them from you. From your attention, from the specific act of listening that you are performing right now. Subscribe to True Terror Files, official, every single night. Something new surfaces. Drop a comment and tell me which of the 5 rewired something inside you. And when you close this tab and the room goes quiet before you reach for the light, just remember, the water knows when you're looking. Good night. I'll see you in the dark.